Chapters 1 and 2 of One Life, One Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. One Life, One Love by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. 1. Dramatis Personae. "Wife," cried Robert Hattrell, coming into the sunny morning room where his wife and her daughter were sitting, the little girl in the broad recessed window with her tutor puzzling over her first French verb, while in front of the window a bed of pink tulips were waving and nodding their rosy cups in the soft April wind. "Wife, can you guess what good news I have brought you?" "Indeed, no, Rob, unless it is that you are going to take me for a long drive. To Burnham Beeches, or the forest, for instance." She was not one of the indifferent, off-hand wives who hardly look up from their work or their book when a husband comes back from his morning walk. She was not even one of those excellent matrons whose affections are concentrated upon the nursery, for whom babies have a higher claim than the breadwinner. Clara Hattrell adored her husband, and was not ashamed to show her affection for him in trivial ways, which marked the line between love and toleration. She laid down her pen, rose from the little davenport, and went over to meet him as he came flushed and smiling into the sunshiny room. "Better than that, ever so much better than that. Not another diamond bracelet, I hope," she said with a touch of petulance. He had a passion for buying things, an amiable weakness which had been pleasant enough up to a certain point, but to which his wife objected when it passed the limits of common sense. "Ungrateful woman! You know, dear, I have more jewelry already than I care to wear. It is not a bracelet. It is not any kind of ornament for the most ungrateful of women. Will that satisfy you?" The little girl never looked up from the indicative mood. The glory of beginning a foreign language overcame her sense of weariness. The tutor never raised his eyelids from the eyes which watched the child puzzling over her book, but he was listening intently all the same. "Not quite, Rob. You have been buying something. I can see it in the sparkle of your eye. You have been wasting a heap of money upon some trumpery or other. I have not spent or incurred a liability to the extent of 3 and 6pence since I left this house, but I have heard something which may lead to my spending £3,000 or £4,000 before we are much older." "The land!" cried Clara, clasping her hands. "My meadows, my gardens." "Precisely. Young Florestan has made up his mind to part with some superfluous territory, and as soon as the lawyers are ready to sell, I shall be able to buy the extra acres for which my fair land-grabber has been pining." "What rapture! And we shall be able to extend the river terrace to twice its present length, and I shall have an Italian garden, a real Italian garden, with marble balustrades, and pan and syrinx, and walls of cypress and yew, and a long avenue of junipers. My dearest dreamer, your cypress walls will take 30 or 40 years to arrive at perfection. They will be something to look forward to in our old age, and we shall have the pleasure of planning everything and watching the things grow. The garden will be our own creation, an emanation from our very selves. Adam and Eve would have tried harder to be worthy of Eden if it had not been ready-made." Robert Hattrell had the sanguine temperament, and had a knack of adopting any idea of his wife's with even greater enthusiasm than her own. He was never more pleased than in pleasing her, yet had marked tastes of his own: pictures, statues, foreign travel, a man of no profession or pursuit, and of an energetic temper, energetic even to restlessness. He was an only son, and had been lord of himself and of between £3,000 and £4,000 a year at an age when most young men are still dependent upon parental benevolence. He had left Oxford without a degree, but with a reputation for considerable talent of an artistic, social, and generally intangible character. He had travelled and amused himself for half a dozen years, enjoying independence, health, and high spirits to the uttermost. He had had his adventures, his disillusions, and his disappointments during that long holiday, and he had only sobered and settled down on marrying one of the prettiest girls of her season, a girl fresh from a Buckinghamshire valley, where her people had been lords of the soil before the Wars of the Roses. She had practically no money, but she came of a race which claimed kindred with Hampden. She had the calm and chaste beauty of the Florentine Venus. She neither flirted nor talked slang, and she knew no more about racing or cars than if she had still been in the nursery. In a word, she was a girl whom Wordsworth or Milton would have accepted as the fairest type of English girlhood, and Robert Hatterell considered himself very lucky in winning her for his wife. His father had been a civil engineer, a genius, successful in all he touched. The rewards of his profession had been large and rapid, and had tempted him to overwork, which resulted eventually, after many notes of warning, in an appallingly sudden death. Robert inherited with the engineer's fortune the engineer's ardent temperament, which, on his part, showed itself in superfluous energy, a feverish activity about trifles. There were times when, in spite of fortune, happy home, and idolized wife, he felt that he had made a mistake in his life, that it would have been better for him to have worked hard and had a career like his father's. He read of the two Brunels and the two Stevensons with a pang of regret. But on this bright April morning there was no shadow upon Robert Hatterell's happiness, no sense of a purpose and a career missed, a life in some wise wasted. He talked of the additional land as if it were the beginning and end of existence. "It will just make the place perfect, Clara," he said. "You are always right, love. We were terribly cramped when we made our garden. The river terrace is well enough, but we have no depth. The grounds are unworthy of the house." He opened a glass door and went out upon the lawn, his wife following him. They stood side by side, and looked first at the house, and then at the garden, this way and that, and then at the river. 11 years ago, on the eve of their marriage, he and Clara, riding together one morning on the Berkshire side of the river, between Reading and Henley, had discovered an old-fashioned cottage in a good-sized garden with a lawn sloping to the river. There were a couple of meadows and an orchard behind the cottage, divided from it by a road, but the best part of the whole thing was this river frontage of less than a quarter of a mile. The cottage was to be let or sold, as a lopsided board announced to the world at large, and the neglected garden gave evidence that it was a long time since the last tenant had departed and left the place to gradual decay. The lovers dismounted, found a door on the latch, and explored the house, which was empty of human life, albeit some shabby furniture and a sandy cat in the kitchen indicated that a caretaker had her habitation on the premises. The thick walls, leaded casements, quaint old staircase, and corridor fascinated Clara. She was passionately fond of the river and of the country in which she had been born and reared. Her future home was to be in Chester Street, Belgravia, but the exploration of the cottage suggested a delightful alternative. "How sweet it would be to have this for a summer home, Rob," she said; and Robert, who was at the period of his most abject slavery, instantly decided that the cottage must be hers. The negotiation of the purchase gave him something to do. Alterations and additions and improvements would make a delightful occupation for husband and wife after the honeymoon. The house in Chester Street had been taken on a 7, 14, or 21 years' lease, a most commonplace business. It was furnished and ready for them. Nothing more to do there. But this cottage would afford endless work. He began to plan at once, even before he knew the owner's name. Of course they must build a drawing room and dining room, and a couple of bedrooms, boudoir, and dressing room on the floor above. The present sitting room would make a pretty hall by knocking down a lath and plaster partition, and throwing in the passage. Those thick walls and great chestnut beams were delightful. He saw his way to an artistic-looking house for very little money. "I am nothing if not inventive," he said. "Remember what my father did. Some faint trickle from that deep stream of intellectual force ought to have come down to me." "I'm sure you would be quite as clever as your father, and would plan viaducts and things as he did, if it were required of you," said Clara admiringly. The cottage was bought, and was the plaything of the first and second year of their married life, their chief amusement, occupation, and excitement. The cottage was always with them, and the greatest pleasure of their foreign wanderings was found in bric-a-brac shops, searching out strange and picturesque things for their new home. At the end of those 2 years, the cottage was no longer a cottage, but a spacious and luxurious house of moderate elevation, with many gables, a tiled roof, and tall chimney-stacks. Mr. Hatterell had remembered Ruskin's axiom that no house can be picturesque in which the roof is not a prominent feature. The garden had been made as perfect as its narrow limits would allow, but everybody felt, and many people said, that the house was too large and too handsome for its surroundings. They had occupied it for 9 years, and the daughter who had entered it a year-old baby was old enough to learn her first French verb, although her education had been conducted in a very leisurely manner. Yet only today had come the hope of possessing the adjoining land, which had been in the hands of trustees until 2 or 3 months ago, when the heir had come of age. The trustees had been unable to sell, and the heir had been unwilling to sell, but a month at Monte Carlo had brought about a change of tactics, and this morning Mr. Hattrell had seen the land agent, and had been told that young Florestan would be glad of an offer for so much of the home farm as might be wanted to perfect Mr. Hattrell's holding. "You will understand that as there is a river frontage, and the land is eminently adapted for building, we shall want a good price for it," said the agent. "Let me know your price without an hour's unnecessary delay. I'd rather not make an offer. I can't be a buyer and seller too," answered Hattrell; and then he walked home at 5 miles an hour, brimming over with delight, triumphant at having such news to carry to his wife. They looked this way and that, and talked, and pointed out boundaries and distances. Those dear old chestnuts in the hedgerow must come down. The river terrace must be continued along there. The meadow would have to be leveled into an upper and lower lawn, and there must be stone balustrades and flights of steps. "I'm afraid it will cost a fortune," said Clara. "We can afford to do it, dear, now we have given up the house in Chester Street." They had discovered 2 or 3 years before that a London house was a useless expense, an incubus even, since it obliged them to live in town when they would rather be in the country. They both infinitely preferred life in Berkshire to life in Belgravia, so on the expiry of the first term of the lease they gave up the house, and sold the bulk of the furniture to the incoming tenant. And now they could spend as much of their time as they liked in the house by the river, and could winter in Italy or Switzerland without any scruples of conscience. When they wanted to reside in London, there were hotels ready to receive them, and on the other hand they could enjoy many metropolitan pleasures while resident at River Lawn, since the journey to the West End took very little more than an hour. The child had stuck to her book with dogged determination while her mother and father were indoors, but the sight of them standing on the lawn was too much for her. Their animated gestures filled her with curiosity. What were they pointing out to each other? What could they be talking about? Her tutor laid his long white fingers upon her shoulder with the slow caressing touch she knew so well. "Where are your thoughts flying, Daisy?" he said gently. "We shan't manage our 2 tenses if you don't attend better." "I'm rather tired," said the little girl, "and I want to go to mother." "Let it be 1 tense, then only 1, but it must be quite perfect. Shut your book, and tell me the French for I am." "Je suis," replied Daisy, watching those sunlit figures on the lawn. Her mother in a gown of cream white woolen stuff, with an orange-colored handkerchief knotted loosely around her neck. The tutor for love, not gain, never looked up. Dreamy at the best of times, he was in an unusually meditative mood this morning. He seemed to be giving a small portion of his brain power to the child, while all the rest was lost in a labyrinth of thought. The present tense, indicative mood of the verb être, was repeated without a hitch. "Good," said Ambrose Arden. "We will have the imperfect tense tomorrow. And now you may run in the garden for half an hour before we read our English history. Perhaps you would like to read out of doors." "Very much, if you please, Uncle Ambrose." She put her arms round his neck, and laid her soft cheek against his silky hair. He had pale auburn hair, which he wore rather long. His skin was as fair as a woman's. Hair and complexion, and the clear bright blue of the large dreamy eyes, gave something of effeminacy to his appearance; but his features were large and boldly cut, a longish nose inclining to aquiline, a strong chin, and wide, resolute mouth. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but had the stoop of a bookish man, whose life was for the most part sedentary. All his movements were slow and deliberate, and his full deep voice had slow and deliberate modulations, a legato movement that answered to the gliding movements of his figure. Daisy flew out to the lawn like an arrow from a bow. She had her mother's hazel eyes, and her mother's vivacity, slim, straight, and swift as Atalanta, with dark brown hair flying in the wind. Ambrose Arden rose slowly and sauntered after her. "May I inquire the cause of all this excitement?" he asked as he approached husband and wife. "Didn't you hear just now, you man of ice?" Robert Hattrell exclaimed laughingly. "Can it be that mundane things have no interest for you, that you have only ears and mind for the abstract?" "I heard something about Floristan's land." "Precisely. Had you been more keenly interested in the welfare of your friends, you might have heard that I have now the chance of buying the additional ground my poor Clara has been pining for ever since we made our garden." "I am very glad," said Arden quietly. "You don't look a bit glad," said Clara. "I am one of those cold-blooded people whose faces do not express what they feel. I am heartily glad all the same, since you and Hattrell are glad." "Oh, it is Clara's business. This place is Clara's creation. She can do what she likes with it," said Hattrell. "I'll have Cruden over this afternoon to plan the new garden." "But, my dear Rob, is it worth while to begin our plans before we are even sure of the ground?" remonstrated Common Sense in the person of his wife. "We are quite sure. It is only a question of 100 or 2 more or less. Florestan wants money, and he can spare the land. We want the land, and we can spare the money. There is always so much time lost in beginning anything. I'll send for Cruden at once." "Yes, and you and Mr. Cruden will have planned every detail before I can make a single suggestion," said Clara. "I know your impetuosity of old." "My love, the new garden was your idea, and you shall carry it out in your way," replied her husband. "But we may as well see Cruden's plan. He is the best man in this part of the country for a job of that kind. We will do nothing without your approval." Clara gave a little impatient sigh. She knew so well for how little her approval would count when once the landscape gardener and his men were set at work; how little pause or leisure there would be for a thought or taste, and how the whole business would be hurried along by her husband's impatient temper till all was fixed and completed, for good or ill. And she knew that the loveliest gardens she had seen had been the slow and gradual growth of care and thought. Mr. Cruden, however, was a prince among nurserymen. He had taste and knowledge, and many acres of nursery ground, and if he were but allowed time, all would no doubt be well. Ambrose Arden strolled down to his favorite seat under a weeping willow, which overhung the river and made a tent of tender green above a rustic bench and table. There were cushions scattered on the ground under the tree, and there was a doll sitting with its sawdust back propped up against the trunk. These and various lesson books indicated that the spot was Daisy's chosen resort. Here in fine weather she carried on her education, under the affectionate guidance of her father's friend and neighbor, Ambrose Arden. When they bought their cottage at Lamford, Mr. and Mrs. Hattrell found Mr. Arden established in a small square brick house on the opposite side of the road, one of those ugly, useful houses which people used to build 70 or 80 years ago amidst loveliest scenery, houses which imply that at a certain period of English history the sense of beauty was dead in the English mind. Houses as square and as unbeautiful are built by the dozen nowadays on the outskirts of French provincial towns, and seem the natural outcome of the small bourgeois retired from business. Time and the mild, moist atmosphere of the Thames Valley had dealt kindly with this sordid building, and had covered it from basement to roof with roses, passion flower, woodbine, and trumpet ash. So clothed and standing in the midst of an old-fashioned garden, it had assumed a certain humble prettiness, as the commonest labourer's cottage will when it has time to ripen. It was quite good enough for Ambrose Arden, the Oxford scholar, the man who had carried off some of the chief prizes of a university career, but whose name from a social point of view had been written in water. Even the men of his year had scarcely heard of him, or at most had heard of him as a poor creature, who neither rode, nor hunted, nor spoke at the Union, nor gave wines, a creature who only sat in his rooms and read. He came to the square brick house at Lamford a widower with one child, a boy of 3 years old. He had married a parson's daughter in a village among the Welsh hills, and had lived with her in that quiet, far-off world until their brief married life ended in sudden darkness. Her son was just beginning to run alone when the young mother, who had never given up the pious and charitable ways of the vicar's daughter, took the contagion of a deadly fever by a sick-bed in a remote homestead hidden among the hills, too far for the elderly vicar to carry words of hope and consolation. Ambrose Arden's wife had taken the duty of visiting these people upon herself. The woman's husband had an evil repute, was known to have ill-used his wife, and she was dying of some mysterious disease, alone and friendless. Amy Arden went daily to visit her, Ambrose walking with her, and while his wife read or talked to the sick woman, he sat on a little rustic bridge that spanned a trout stream hard by, reading the book he always carried in the pocket of his shooting coat. Never had Ambrose Arden been known to leave his house unsupplied with intellectual food of some kind. Whether the dying woman's malady was contagious, or whether the house itself reeked with drain poison, the doctors never decided. All Ambrose knew was that his young wife fell a victim to her own large-hearted charity. From her childhood she had ministered to her father's flock, and she was stricken with death in the path of duty. Mr. Arden left the rustic cottage in the Radnorshire village, in which he had lived for 3 years in comfort and refinement upon a very small income, which he had inherited from his mother. He was an only child, the last, as he supposed, of a race that had slowly exhausted itself, a race of gentlefolks who had neither toiled nor spun, and who had done very little to distinguish themselves in the busy places of this world. They were a Cheshire family, and they had lived on their own land and had seen their importance and their means gradually decaying, from generation to generation, without being moved to any strong stand-up fight against adverse fortune. Some of them had been soldiers, and some of them had been students, not undistinguished in the records of the university; but the active temper which can redeem the fortunes of a race had been unknown in the house of Arden. Ambrose fled from Radnorshire with a great horror of the soil on which he left the grave of his dead wife. He had been very fond of her, not with a passionate or romantic attachment, but with a mild and in some wise fatherly affection, appreciating the sweetness of a most perfect character. She had never been more to him than a dear and tenderly loved friend; and his affection at the beginning of their married life had been as placid, temperate, and serious as the love of gray-haired Darby for gray-haired Joan after their golden wedding. It did not seem within the capacities of the student's nature to care passionately for anything outside the world of thought. He went to London and lived in a lodging near the British Museum for about half a year, while his infant son was cared for by a little staymaker at Roehampton, who had about half a rood of garden ground behind her cottage. The boy throve well enough in this humble home, and Ambrose used to walk to Roehampton every Sunday to look at him. All his weekdays he spent in the reading room of the museum. One day he discovered that his boy had grown very fond of him. He cried and clung to his father at parting, and then it first entered into his father's mind that he might make a home for his son, and for his books, which had accumulated rapidly since he had lived in London, the temptations at the second-hand bookshops being irresistible to a man for whom the world of books was almost the only world. The valley of the Thames was fairer and more familiar to the Oxonian than any other part of England. It was also within reach of the great reading room, so it was on the banks of the Thames that Ambrose Arden looked for a home. He found a cottage and a good old garden for £30 a year, and as his prowlings about the lamplit streets within a 1-mile radius of the museum had made him familiar with a great many brokers' shops, he had no difficulty in getting together the few articles of furniture necessary for the establishment of a widower with an infant son. A carpenter from Henley put up pitch pine shelves for the student's existing library, and provided space for future purchases, and with his books and his son, Ambrose Arden settled down to that dreamy life which he had now been leading for between 11 and 12 years. The Hatteralls made their neighbor's acquaintance casually one summer evening on the river, where the student was sitting in a punt with his boy, the father absorbed in a book, the boy fishing, moored to the willowy bank, and where Robert Hatterall was sculling his wife slowly towards the sunset in his capacious skiff, the strong rhythmical stroke bearing witness to the time when he was one of the best oars in the University 8. The casual acquaintance soon ripened into an easy and familiar intercourse, and with the passing years intimacy became friendship. The two men had been at Oxford together, albeit they had no memory of ever having met there. They had some tastes in common, although one was all energy, the other all repose. Mrs. Hatterall was a voracious reader, and looked to Mr. Arden for counsel and help in the choice of books. By the new lights afforded by his wide knowledge of the best authors, she found many a pleasant shortcut to a higher level of thought and culture than governess or professors had revealed to her. She grew to depend upon him for intellectual guidance, and it was with delight she accepted his offer to educate her only child after his own plan. "It seems almost absurd to see you wasting your time upon that child," she said, feeling some compunction at the beginning of things. "I have plenty of time to waste, and Daisy's education will serve as amusement and relaxation for me. Now that Cyril is at Winchester, I have no young thing to lighten my life except Daisy." "But to see you teaching a child of 7 seems rather like setting a Nasmyth hammer to crack a nut." "One of the boasted merits of the Nasmyth hammer is that it can crack a nut. Let me think that I have not lost the lightness and delicacy of a mind which can understand the workings of a child's brain." The mother submitted, and was grateful, and it gradually became a familiar thing to see Ambrose Arden, the grave student of 37, whose magnum opus was to make a revolution in the history of philosophy, bending over the brown-eyed child and teaching her history upon his own plan, which was to begin in the valley of Euphrates, and travel gradually downward through the ages, from the dim fairyland of the East to the finished civilization of modern Europe. He had a genius for simplification, and contrived to make the broad outlines of ancient history clear and interesting even to that infant mind. He had traveled over all the same ground with his boy Cyril, who was now distinguishing himself at Winchester, whence he came nearly every Saint's Day to see his father. 2. Confidences. The moon rose at 9 o'clock that evening, and Robert Hattrell sauntered into the garden after dinner to smoke and meditate upon the projected improvements. With him action was everything, and reverie, however pleasant, rarely lasted long. Tonight the meditative mood lasted no longer than a single cigarette. That finished, he opened a little gate in the kitchen garden and strolled across the road. Another little gate admitted him into his neighbor's garden, and he went straight to the open window of the roomy parlor which Ambrose had converted into a study, by the simple process of lining it from floor to ceiling with books. An old knee-hole desk occupied the center of the floor, and 3 chairs and an old-fashioned sofa completed the sum of the furniture. It looked a snug and congenial room for a student, shabby as it was, in the light of the shaded lamp by which Ambrose sat reading, unconscious that anyone was looking at him. "Shut your dusty tome, old bookworm, and come for a stroll in the moonlight," said Hattrell. Whereupon the student rose and obeyed him without a word, like a man of weaker will obeying one of stronger will. A cigarette was offered and taken, and the 2 men walked along the road in silence, broken only by a commonplace remark or two about the weather and the night, until Robert Hattrell said abruptly, "Are you sure it was the same man?" "The man you have described to me? Assuredly it was. What other man should know your story?" "No, perhaps not. I doubt if there is anyone else who would know. The whole matter is easy enough to understand. This man is one of many, all on the verge of starvation, refugees of the Commune who have been dragging out a miserable existence in London since last May, nearly a year. I, who am a Republican and a nihilist in theory, have sympathies with these men who have tried to reduce theory to practice. So I whipped up a few pounds, your fiver among others, and took the money to a public house in Greek Street, where my friends assemble of an evening, and distributed it among them in accordance with their necessities. While telling these poor wretches the source of the money I happened to mention your name, and the man followed me into the street afterwards and questioned me about you. I naturally refused to answer questions which I considered impertinent, and then he told me his story. And of course made the worst of it. He told it in a vindictive spirit. And you think perhaps that I ought to have acted differently, that Claude Morel, the chemist's assistant, ought at this moment to be my brother-in-law? My dear Hattrell, a man's relations with women are just the one part of his life which no other man has the right to question, and in which counsel and opinion are worse than useless." "That's no answer," exclaimed Hattrell impatiently. "Why don't you say at once that I ought to have married a milliner's apprentice, and had that man for my brother-in-law? He would not have been a very agreeable connection, I admit, in practice, although in theory all men are equal. There are plenty of men of as low a grade socially whom I would accept as my friend and equal to-morrow, but not Claude Morel. The fellow bears the brand of Cain upon his forehead. It was men of his stamp who made the Commune what it was. He was one of their speakers, the intellectual element, the force that set other men's brains on fire. I was sorry to see great hulking honest fellows under his influence. I could read the history of last year's riot and murder in that little room in Soho. A very dangerous man, your Claude Morel." "Yet you think he ought to have been my brother-in-law," said Hatterell, slashing at the flowery bank with his stick, harping irritably on the question. "No, no, no. Since you were not so far entangled with the sister as to—" "But I was entangled. I loved her, man. Yes, I was over head and ears in love with that milliner's apprentice, and had more than half a mind to fling Prudence to the winds and marry her. She was very young, very confiding, and altogether innocent. Yes, a grisette in Paris, and innocent. God knows how long that would last. She had left her native village less than a year before I met her, had travelled to Paris to find her brother, who had apprenticed her to a milliner in the Rue Neuve des Petits Champs. We met by purest accident in a street crowd. She hustled and frightened in the mob. I happened to protect her. I walked home with her, ever so far, beyond the Bastille, and so began an acquaintance which might have ended, God knows how, if that young man had not tried to force the running. I have to thank his violence, not my prudence, for my escape and for my sweet English wife. I shudder to think of the difference such a marriage as that must have made in my life." "That depends upon the strength of your love," said Arden. "I can imagine a man loving so deeply and truly as never to regret having married beneath him. No, Arden, repentance must come. It is the aftertaste of passion, and a gentleman's love for a peasant girl can be only passion at best. That depends upon the gentleman. Ah, you are in provoking mood tonight, I see. Did this fellow tell you what has become of his sister, whether she is dead or living?" "No, he went into no particulars, nor did I encourage him by asking questions. He talked of broken promises, broken hearts, a blighted life, pride and cruelty, talked as you may suppose a communist, nurtured upon Le Père Duchesne, would talk of an English gentleman who had, in his idea, compromised and disappointed his sister. I cut him as short as I possibly could, only I considered it my duty to let you know that the man is in London, and that he threatens to hunt you out and revenge his sister's wrongs, her supposed wrongs, we will say, in some way or other. That means lying in wait for me at the corner of a London street to shoot me, or to throw vitriol in my face, I suppose," said Hatterell, with a scornful laugh. "I must take my chance of the bullet or the vitriol. It may be only an empty threat, but I own I don't like the man's physiognomy or his history, and I recommend you to be on your guard. It might be wise to try and get him out of the country. I dare say he would emigrate to one of the colonies if emigration were made profitable to him. Arden, do you think I am such a poltroon as to buy my life from a foreign bully? He threatened me in Paris, and I turned him out of my room neck and crop. He wanted to frighten me into a marriage with his sister by pretending to believe that I was her seducer. But that was not the worst. When I told him that marriage was impossible, he insinuated that there might be other arrangements. A wealthy Englishman in love with a girl of inferior station might make such a settlement as would ensure the comfort and respectability of her future life without the legal tie. In a word, the man was and is a scoundrel. He knew that I was rich, and he wanted to make a market out of me. Don't you know that chantage is a profession in Paris? A profession to which a lazy scoundrel looks as the one royal road to competence. And he found that I was not a singing bird. Whatever debt I owed to my little Toinette, it was not one that he could force me to pay. And do you suppose that now, 14 years after, I would reward his bluster with a concession of so much as a sixpence? If you do think so poorly of me, Arden, you must be a very bad judge of human nature. Perhaps I am wrong, but I have your wife to think of as well as you. What if this man were to come here and tell his story? To my wife? Let him. She will believe no man's word against mine. Indeed, I have talked to her about Antoinette, or at least I have told her, half in sport and half in earnest, that I was once in love with a grisette. And I am not afraid to tell her the whole truth, that in my salad days, 2 years before I saw her fair young face, I was very hard hit by that same grisette, and trifled with her longer than I ought, and had even half a mind to marry her, and only pulled myself up sharp when her brute of a brother interfered. I need not tell her that I sent the girl £100 in my farewell letter, and wished her a good husband in her own rank of life, who would respect her all the more for that dot, and for the knowledge that I could sign myself in all sincerity and honor her faithful friend. Ah, Ambrose Arden, you who have given your heart to books can never imagine how this foolish heart of mine ached as I wrote that letter. I own that I have lived more among books than among human beings, yet I can conceive the possibility of an overmastering love bearing down all barriers, weighing caste and circumstance as feathers in the scale against passion. But what I cannot conceive is that such intense feeling can be transient, that such a love can ever give place to another. Ah, but you see I do not pretend that my fancy for Antoinette was ever a grande passion. My heart ached at throwing her off, but the heartache came as much from my sympathy with her in her disappointment as from my own sense of loss. I was never really in love till I met Clara. She accepted your £100, I suppose? I hope so. It never came back to me. But as I received no acknowledgment from my poor little friend, it is likely enough her brother intercepted my money and her letter, counseled her to refuse the gift indignantly perhaps, and then put my banknotes in his pocket. I believe this fellow to be capable of anything sneaking and infamous. And you never heard of Antoinette after that letter? Never. I left Paris the next day. The city seemed dull and dark without the light of those southern eyes. It was in autumn, the dead season, and I went off to Petersburg and thence to Odessa to look at my father's work there, and to feel sorry I was not as good a man as he. The air has turned chilly. Will you come in and play a rubber? With pleasure. They turned and went back to River Lawn. They went in by the hall door into that roomy, low-ceiled hall which had formed the greater part of the basement of the original cottage, and which was a triumph of engineering skill on Mr. Hattrell's part. Ponderous cherry-wood beams supported the ceiling, which was further sustained by 2 oak pillars carved in a bold and vigorous style of art, which looked as if it had been executed under the Heptarchy. A procession of short-nosed Druids and Saxon kings, with Boadicea in her chariot leading the way, encircled those stunted pillars in a diagonal line, and many an erudite person had expatiated upon their antique preciousness until silenced by Robert Hattrell's uproarious laughter. Tonight, in the shine of the lamps, the hall glowed with the vivid hues of Italian stripes and Persian embroidery, and through the open door the large, airy drawing-room revealed its more delicate coloring and cool sea-green draperies. Mother and daughter were sitting at a small round table, with the light of a reading lamp concentrated upon their bright, eager faces, as they arranged the pieces of a large puzzle map, the child intensely eager to forestall her mother. "Oh, Mother, you've put India next to Russia. One so hot and the other so cold. That can't be right," cried Daisy. The round Chippendale card table was set ready at a respectful distance from the fire. 2 shaded lamps shed their mild radiance upon the cards and the markers. The rubber was a nightly institution, and there were few evenings upon which Ambrose Arden did not come in to take his part in the game, he and Mrs. Hattrell playing against the master of the house, who liked no partner at whist so well as dummy. Clara and her partner were in perfect sympathy in their dislike of cards, and therefore they both played in unimpassioned, ineffectual, and often inattentive game, which left Robert Hattrell master of the situation. He played with a fervor and vigor which could have carried a bill through the house, or silenced an enemy's fort, and he enjoyed the eager, rapid hour's play with an enjoyment which was exhilarating to his companions. And then, the hour having ended in his triumph, and the complete humiliation of his opponents, he would rise from the table, exultant and beaming, and pace up and down the room, talking as few men can talk, with a rush of eloquence even about small things. When the 3 players had taken their seats, Daisy came to say good night, having stayed up till 9:30, a prodigious indulgence. She kissed her mother and father, and then went to Mr. Arden, and put her arms round his neck, and kissed him almost as fondly as she had kissed the other 2. He detained her for a minute or so, while Hattrell was dealing for the always favored dummy. "Shall we have the imperfect tense tomorrow, Daisy?" "Yes. I nearly know it now. I shall quite know it tomorrow." "And tomorrow will be today, and even these kisses of yours will be in the imperfect tense, won't they, pet? Things that have been. God bless mother's treasure. Good night." He said the words almost reverently, with a touch of deeper feeling than is usually given to fatherly good nights. Robert Hattrell had not even looked up from the cards when his child kissed him. It was a pretty domestic picture in the cheerful light of lamps and fire, the three figures at the table, so calm, so reposeful, with such passionless countenances, the child's vivid face moving amidst them, looking with rapid glances from one to the other. Family affection, unclouded peace, unquestioning love, could hardly be more perfectly expressed than they were that night in Robert Hattrell's drawing room. End of chapters 1 and 2.